Welcome to the GRID3's webinar series. Today's webinar is on population modeling and how to produce population estimates for humanitarian and development purposes. The presenters for this webinar are Edith Darin and Gianluca Bu, two of our WorldPop modelers, and myself, Attila Lazar, the GRID3 lead and scientific coordinator at WorldPop. GRID3 stands for Georeferenced Infrastructure and Demographic Data for Development. GRID3 program works with countries to generate, validate, and use geospatial data on population, settlements, infrastructure, and administrative boundaries. GRID3 combines the expertise of partners in government, United Nations, academia, and the private sector to design adaptable and relevant geospatial solutions based on capacity and development needs of each country. GRID3 is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the United Kingdom's Department for International Development, DFID. It is implemented by Columbia University's Center for International Earth Science Information Network, CISN, the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, WorldPop at the University of Southampton, and the Flowminder Foundation. This webinar will focus on one of our solutions, the high-resolution population estimates. In this webinar, we will be talking about the importance of high-resolution population estimates for decision-making, what GRID3 does, and why we do it. We will also discuss how we produce the gridded population estimates, covering the difference between the top-down and bottom-up modeling approaches, and we'll go into more detail on the bottom-up population approach, which is most used population estimation method in GRID3. Finally, we will cover one application example of gridded population data and how you can get in touch with us after this webinar. Let's start with the importance of gridded population data for decision-making. Demographic data is key to every decision that governments, planners, and humanitarian and development agencies make. Thus, reliable demographic data is essential for impactful operational work and sustainable planning. Demographic data includes a range of information, including the size, age, density, and location of the population. This data helps government and society to best respond to population's needs and to monitor changes in population numbers and characteristics. Outdated or incomplete data can hinder policy or program effectiveness. In these cases, our population estimation methods can be invaluable to fill in the gaps. To introduce our solutions, it is worth reviewing the challenges associated with traditional population data. In some countries, traditional population data sources can be outdated or incomplete due to the lack of infrastructure, capacity, or financial resources. For example, if the last census was in 2006, decision makers need to use strong assumptions on fertility, mortality, life expectancy, migration rates, and displacement to create projected total population numbers so they can make decisions for today. In addition, traditional population data often has coarse resolution, for example, available only at province level. In other cases, some areas cannot be reached for insecurity or inaccessibility reasons. Finally, due to urbanization or migration, some populations might be missed out by the census, which again can result in suboptimal program efficiencies. To provide countries with accurate and relevant high-resolution population data, GRID3 uses two complementary pathways: assistance in the generation and utilization of high-resolution population and housing census data, for example through census modernization, and population modeling, which provides gridded population estimates. Please note that population estimates do not replace the full census. Census collects a wealth of information that would be difficult and in some cases even impossible to calculate statistically. Therefore, population estimation is a complementary approach that can fill some gaps in census and can also be used in intercensal periods. This webinar will focus on the model-based population estimates. To support planning and targeted humanitarian and development interventions, the GRID3 population modeling team applies novel statistical methods to estimate population numbers at a 100 by 100 meter resolution and also quantify the modeled uncertainties. You will hear an overview of these in the next sections of the webinar.
So now let's dig into the specificity of the GRID3 approach for population modeling. First, we have to define what do we mean with gridded population dataset and which insight can it give, which further insight can it give. So this format of population data is directly coming from spatial analysis, geographical analysis. And it's basically, the idea is that you're overlaying a grid over the area of interest. This grid is made out of grid cells that have the same shape and the same size. And for each of these grid cells, you assign the value of the phenomenon of interest. For demographic data, this value would be population count. So each grid cells are the population living in these grid cells. So let's take an example. This is the neighborhood of Kano in Nigeria, and you see with the satellite imagery where the people are living, given the buildings, where the buildings are. But which gridded population estimates, you have the population count for each grid cells actually. So you see exactly in the more purple areas where there is a denser population, and in the outskirts of this neighborhood, the beige area where there is less people. And when you compare it with the official figures at all local government area levels that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see directly how it's more interesting to have a finer resolution, because with the census data, you will have just a number for the whole area, whereas with the gridded population dataset, you have the variation in density. So if you zoom out, the same idea reproduced at a higher scale. So the fact that for the whole area surrounding Kano, the city, you see the different hotspot across it, like where there are villages or where there are no one, and which villages are a bit larger than others. So population gridded population data that are really interesting. We already seen for visualization purposes that it's easy to compare between areas. You have a fine understanding of the variation of the population density. But it offers also a great flexibility in aggregation. So with only one dataset, this gridded population dataset, you can at the same time have an estimate of the population living in a state or in a province, in a local government area, in a city, in a village, given the boundaries that you want. So you just sum up the grid cells that are in the area of interest. The two last points is that this kind of dataset can be easily integratable with ancillary datasets, so road network, or the location of health facilities, or the location of shops, and so on. And with this smooth surface, so basically you have actually a surface of population across the whole country, not only a discrete table data with population for every provinces. And this smooth data around population also leverage way more statistical power for any algorithm, but that's for the more statistician of us. So let's take an example of the kind of analysis that can be actually done only using gridded population datasets. So on this side, you can see the locations of different health facilities across different local government areas. And the question that you want to answer is how many people are living around the health facilities in order to understand the catchment area of these health facilities. With a normal dataset, you wouldn't know, because you would know only the total figure for the entire local government area. But with a gridded population dataset, since you have a precise number for each grid cells, you can actually just sum up the grid cells that are 1 kilometer around these health facilities, and then having a precise estimate of the number of people that can access this health facility.
In this section, I'm going to talk about the GRID3 approach to gridded population estimation. This approach has 5 essential characteristics. The main feature is that the work of GRID3 is adapted to the individual country's situation and needs. GRID3 acts as the most accurate data available and tailors the modeling methods accordingly. The population estimation typically consists of population counts and age and sex structures within grid cells. While the GRID3 population estimates do not enable to provide the same richness of attributes of the national census, they can enable to predict population counts and age and sex breakdowns in areas that cannot be accessed by the surveyors. The population estimates are of high resolution, both in terms of spatial detail, where the grid cell has a resolution of 100 by 100 meters, and temporal accuracy with the use of the most recent survey data. Still, given that the accuracy of the population estimates heavily depends on the quality of the input data, measures of model uncertainty can be extremely useful for effective decision-making. And last, given that the decision-making can be carried out at different geographic levels, being the health zone or the municipality, the flexible aggregation of both population estimates and uncertainty measure can be extremely valuable for stakeholders. This brings us to the key element of this section. How is GRID3 producing gridded population estimates? GRID3 uses 2 methods to produce gridded population estimates, depending on the country situation and needs. On the left, the top-down modeling method. This method spatially disaggregates population counts from the original census units using geospatial covariates related to the distribution of population, for instance, light intensity at night or vegetation coverage. The different covariates are used to weight the disaggregation process using different classification techniques, for example, random forest classifiers. The output of the population disaggregation is a gridded surface where population counts are allocated to each settled cell. While the top-down method can improve the spatial accuracy of the original census data, it also assumes full and up-to-date census enumeration. When these conditions are not met, GRID3 uses a bottom-up modeling method, here on the right. The figure shows that this method involves similar components to the top-down modeling. Focusing on the differences, the census data is replaced by microcensus survey data, in other words, the full enumeration of the population within a small and well-defined geographic area. This information is then linked to geospatial covariates by means of statistical models, for instance, Bayesian hierarchical models, to estimate the relationship between population and covariates and ultimately predict outside the microcensus areas. Similar to the disaggregation methodology, the output is a gridded surface where population counts are allocated to each settled cell. In the next slides, I will focus on the different components of the bottom-up modeling approach. First, I will talk about the input data to bottom-up modeling. The bottom-up modeling approach combines population data from small and well-defined geographic areas with geospatial data, mostly derived from satellite imagery. This input data is fed into statistical models that produce high-resolution gridded population estimates. The 3 essential input data describe population, settlement, and geographic context. Population data can be derived from different kinds of surveys, from national censuses to bespoke microcensuses. Settlement data is derived from satellite imagery and involve, for example, settlement type and shape on the individual buildings. Ancillary geospatial covariates are meant to describe geographic context, for instance, elevation, slope, vegetation type, or accessibility to major cities. The population data is at the core of the bottom-up model and can be derived from different sources. These data sources can be diverse and used individually or in combination depending on the situation. A first element is administrative totals derived from census or other enumeration exercises. Partial censuses or pre-census listings can also be used provided that they have clear geographic boundaries or GPS locations with the survey points. Population data can be also derived from bespoke microcensuses that usually involve limited cost compared to large-scale surveys. GRID3 has conducted a number of microcensuses in countries where comprehensive and up-to-date census data is not available. The figure shows a microcensus enumeration unit, or a cluster, where population counts and age and sex attributes are captured. The areal extent of an enumeration unit is generally of 3 settled hectares, because it should be surveyed within a day. Within the microcensus boundaries, each building is georeferenced, and for residential buildings, each household is surveyed. The second data input for population estimation is settlement data. Settlement data is derived from settlement layers that are a representation of built-up areas from satellite imagery. Settlement layers can be retrieved by semi-automatic extraction of features from satellite imagery, for instance in the global settlement layer, the global human footprint, and the Copia building footprint. Settlement layers can also be derived from volunteer geographic information, VGI, where OpenStreetMap contributors manually digitize building features. Settlement data are meant to be a proxy for the geographic distribution of population and are crucial to predict population counts and age and sex structures outside the microcensus clusters. More information about settlement layers is available in a dedicated web binder. Last, geospatial covariates, as a general term for a multitude of input data that are meant to represent the geographic context. Geospatial covariates are data describing the context where the people live in. This involves 3 essential requirements. First, the influence of the population spatial distribution. Second, it should be available for the entire area or country. Third, it should include explicit geographic information, such as GPS coordinates or admin boundaries. Geospatial covariates should provide different insights on the location of population. Some are related to physical context, such as distance to roads and rivers, others to the socioeconomic context, such as urban accessibility and fossil fuel emissions. GRID3 is able to produce hundreds of different geospatial covariates, also in data-scarce environments. But at the end, only a subset, including the most important, is used for population estimation.
Now let's see what we actually want to achieve with the model, the bottom-up model, and what are the outputs. So, as expected, one of the first output is the high-resolution gridded population estimates. Associated to that, we also predict the age and sex structures for each grid cells, and we also provide a measure of uncertainty for each of these estimates. So first, the gridded population estimates is a high-resolution one at 100 by 100 meter for each grid cells. As we also provide with that, and that's easy, we just provide the population total. So we aggregate the population, the gridded population data at the administrative areas of the country. And then we also produce a decomposition by age and sex. So what does it mean? It means that for each grid cells, we will know how many female, for example, will live here, how many female between 20 and 25. And so for each grid cells, of course, but we can, as we already seen, aggregate those grid cells for the entire area. For example, around the health facilities, how many people, women between 20 and 25 years old are living here. And we wanted just to mention that we also produce uncertainty measures, because we shouldn't forget that each of these estimates are coming out of a model, which means that they are not like ground truth. And for each of those grid cells, it's actually the population count is going to be a mean estimate. What does it mean? It is that for each of those grid cells, we actually predict a distribution. So the mean estimate is going to be the more likely population count that can be observed in reality in this grid cell. But sometimes, for some analysis, we want to be 95% sure that there is at least this amount of people when planning for vaccination, for example. So given the goal of the analysis, different outputs can be needed. Let's dig now into the art of the model itself. For the purpose of understanding the logic behind population estimation, we're going to just give example. We're not going to go through the magic, the statistical magic behind it, but keep with us because that's the interesting bit of population modeling. So as starting point, we're going to consider two clusters. What we're calling cluster is a given area where we do know the number of people. So it's going to be from surveys, as we've seen, or from census. From cluster 1, we know that there are 500 people, and from cluster 2, we know that there's 100 people. And we're going to first consider one geospatial covariance, which is the settlement density. And we can see from the satellite imagery that the settlement density is quite low in cluster 1 and quite high in cluster 2. So the first idea is to model the relationship between the population size and the settlement density. So we can plot it. So cluster 1 is has a low population size and low settlement density. Cluster 2, the opposite, high population size, high settlement density. And we know this relationship for the whole surveyed cluster. From this link between population size and the settlement density, we can estimate the underlying relationship. So we know we have surveyed some points. This is Nigeria, and we have surveyed some points across the country, but all the blank area, we don't know how many people are living there. And so we can derive it from the previously estimated relationship and the uncertainty linked to it. So from a point A, where we know, or point B and point C, we know from the settlement layer, what is the settlement density. And then from the relationship that has been previously estimated, we know we can derive the population size. But here we just considered only one geospatial covariance, which is the settlement density. But there's plenty of covariance that can explain the density of population. So, for example, we can consider the mean slope. So in cluster 1, the mean slope is quite high. There is some mountains and hills and valleys. From cluster 2, the mean slope is quite low. Cluster 1 gives us a night light that is quite low. If, of course, we are in a rural area. Cluster 2 in an urban area has a night light that are quite high. And we also can consider distance to urban center. So while cluster 2 is actually an urban center, so the distance to urban center is really low, the distance to a proper urban center in cluster 1 can be higher because the city will be far away. And so from all the cluster where we have surveyed the population, we can estimate this relationship. Let's look a bit on the graph. So population density, as we said, is a positive relationship. The more there is settlement, the more there is population. Mean slope, we can predict it, already understand that it's going to be a negative one, because when there is a low slope, so a flat area, they're more likely to have a lot of population, whereas in a mountainous area, there's less likely to be highly populated. Night lights is going to be a positive one, exactly as the settlement density. The more the night lights, the more the population living there. And urban center, negative one. The lowest the distance, the highest the population, because you're going to be actually in an urban center. And so from all this relationship, we can actually model in surveyed area and then predict the population in unsurveyed area. So that's the basic behind both the modeling. And if you want to learn more, you can check it in our papers.
Gridded population estimates can be applied to tackle various development issues. Here we are showing one application example prepared by colleagues at Flowminder Foundation that is related to education. The school optimization tool uses population estimates, school location, and enrollment data to identify priority areas for school expansion. We are working with education boards to provide key indicators on current school coverage in order to help planning school expansion with the placement and number of schools needed by increasing the capacity of selected existing schools. The left map shows the population density at 3-kilometer radius at existing school locations. At a glance, you can see locations with no school but high population density. With these identified gaps, the simulation tool can optimize and suggest locations where new schools should be placed. This is what is shown on the right map using Katsina State as an example. The service placement optimization method utilizes static gridded population data to place services based on the location of residence of the users. In this context, the GRID3 population estimates are combined with existing data on the schools for which to optimize future placement to achieve optimum coverage and capacity of each facility. The method produces service coverage indicators and simulates the placement of new schools and the enlargement of existing ones with geocoordinates and a priority order. We are using school data and GRID3 population estimates of school-age children to calculate a set of child-oriented indicators to support and aid decision-making. The indicators focus on accessibility, enrollment, and out-of-school prevalence. The Early Childhood Care and Education Program, or ECHE, is a universal two-year preschool program. The left-hand map is showing the percentage of children age 1 to 4 within 2 kilometers of such a school within a local government area. This analysis indicates that there are less children within 2-kilometer radius of existing ECHE schools in the northeast and northwest compared to other areas of the country. On the right, the map is visualizing the enrollment figures across the country. The results clearly show that distance to school negatively correlates with the enrollment levels and thus highlights the importance of distance as a barrier to children attending schools. I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction to population modeling. If you would like to know more about the GRID3 team, our solutions and products, please visit our website at www.grid3.org. There are a number of scientific publications available on population modeling and applications. 2 papers related to our slides are listed on the next slide. But if you are interested in the topic, have questions about the methods or about the applications, or you would like to get in touch with us for any other reasons, please drop us an email at info@grid3.org. Thank you for listening.